All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Let's get right into this stuff because I heart this so much. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. Let's talk about the anatomy of the heart. We're going to get into preparation for the dissection that we're going to be doing here in a little bit, which is really cool. It's one of my favorites. Oh, heck, they're all my favorite. I can't choose between my favorites. So let's go about the different parts. These are the things that you're going to be responsible for looking for when you actually lay your heart out on the table. Okay? So let's keep going. The heart is a pump. In humans, it is a 4-chambered organ that pumps blood through both circuits of the circulatory system. Now, the two circuits that we're looking at are the systemic and the pulmonary systems. We'll talk about that a little bit here and then in greater detail when we do the vessels and stuff like that. It has two sides, the right side and the left side. Now, remember, when we're talking about right and left, it is the opposite of what you are looking at. So if you look at the picture down here at the bottom, the left side of the picture is the right side of the heart, and the right side of the picture is the left side of the heart. Let's keep it nice and confusing, okay? Let's see. The right side of the heart is going to receive deoxygenated blood from the systemic circuit. The systemic circuit is all the blood that goes to the parts of your body that are not your lungs, your brain, your stomach, your muscles, stuff like that, okay? So the right side of the heart is going to take deoxygenated blood, that means blood that's got carbon dioxide, back to the lungs to pick up oxygen. The left side of the heart is going to take blood from the pulmonary circuit, that's blood that leaves your lungs, and sends it to the rest of the body. So this is your oxygenated blood coming from your lungs, going to the systemic circuit, which is the rest of your body, to deliver the oxygen and pick up the carbon dioxide. Your heart is located in the thoracic cavity near the anterior chest wall, anterior, so towards the front, directly posterior to the sternum, so about here-ish if you look at my picture. The great vessels, so like the aorta and the superior and inferior vena cavas, are connected to the superior end of the heart. So all of the major blood vessels are here, even the inferior vena cava, which runs that way, and we'll talk about that later. The heart sits in a region known as the mediastinum between the two pleural cavities that hold your lungs. And the heart, if you notice, sits slightly left of the midline. So if you're to do a mid-sagittal cut of the body, the heart would not divide into two equal sections. Okay, let's talk about some of the tissues, starting with the outermost layer of the heart known as the pericardium. The pericardium is going to surround the heart. It's got two layers, the fibrous and the serous pericardium. The fibrous pericardium is a dense network of collagen fibers, so think of like rubber bands, basically, that are going to stabilize the position of the heart and the associated vessels. The serous pericardium has two layers on its own, the parietal layer and the visceral layer. The visceral layer is also the epicardium, which is the outermost layer of the actual heart proper, so there's a little bit of overlap in there. In between the two serous layers, the two layers of the serous pericardium is known as the pericardial cavity, which is just a very small fluids-filled space. Inflammation of the pericardium is known as pericarditis. Itis tells us it's infection or inflammation. Pericarditis can be some really bad news because it can restrict heart function. You can actually have too much fluid building up in the pericardial cavity. That's a cardiac tamponade, which can also squeeze the heart, similar to pericarditis. All right, so moving inward then, the actual heart itself, a couple of tissues that we want to look at here is the auricle, which is an expandable extension of the atrium right here. You have them on both sides, right and left. We also have the coronary sulcus, which is a deep groove. If you look over here on the left-hand side there, maybe on that side, I don't know, whatever, that separates the atria from the ventricles, and that actually corresponds to another structure that we're going to look at when we get into the interior structures. We also have the interventricular sulcus. There's one on the anterior and there's one on the posterior, so the front part of the heart and the back side of the heart. And this is a shallow groove that separates the left ventricles and the right ventricles, and this corresponds with an interior structure also. Let's talk about the heart wall for just a second. The heart wall has 3 layers: the endocardium, the myocardium, and the epicardium. That's going from inside to outside. Endo meaning inside, epi meaning outside. Myo, if you remember from the muscle unit, myo is muscle, so that's where the heart muscle, that cardiac muscle that we talked about briefly. The epicardium is the 2 layers of the serous pericardium. So there's some overlap there, okay, as far as the terminology of what we're going to be talking about. That serous pericardium is part of the heart, and it's also part of the pericardium, okay? The myocardium is the cardiac muscle that actually forms the atria and the ventricles. And then the endocardium is the inner part of the heart, including the valves. And this is simple squamous epithelial tissue. The heart, believe it or not, has its own skeleton, basically a framework in which we build all of the muscle tissue on, essentially. And so they provide physical support, they distribute the force of the cardiac muscle in a regular fashion, provide strength and elasticity to help the heart spring back into shape so the ventricles open and close on their own and stuff like that. This cardiac skeleton is a dense band. It's actually 4 dense bands of elastic tissue that encircle the heart and the valves, and is the base of the pulmonary trunk, which ends up breaking into the major blood vessels, the aorta being one of them. Okay, here we are with the major internal structures of the heart. So these are going to be ones that you're also going to have to be able to identify when we go through the dissection. So you can follow along with me as I explain my way through them. I'm going to go through this whole list here, but it's going to be a little bit cleaner as we go through. So follow along with me or copy them down, find a good image on the internet if you're doing digital notes, or draw a diagram and label all these, either right now or as we're going through them here in a moment. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the interatrial septum. A septum is a piece of tissue that divides a space into 2 smaller spaces. So this separates the atrium. The interventricular septum does the same thing with the ventricles. In between the atria and the ventricles are the atrioventricular valves. There is also known as the tricuspid and the mitral valve. The right AV valve is the tricuspid valve, and the left AV valve is the mitral valve. So you'll want to know both terms. The semilunar valves are the valves in between the ventricles and the great vessels. So there's a pulmonary valve that leads to your lungs, and there's an aortic valve that leads to the aortic arch. The foramen ovale is an opening between the 2 atria of the fetal heart. Now that opening closes as the heart is developing in utero. Now there are some disorders that are characterized by this foramen not closing, at which point, as soon as the baby is born, they have to do open heart surgery to close it up in some cases. The fossa ovalis is a shallow depression in the adult heart where the foramen ovale used to be. So it's kind of like a scar of where they used to be, and you can see it right there. Let's move to the other side now. We've got the papillary muscles. The papillary muscles are the muscles that are actually going to attach. We've got two sets here and here that are actually going to help control the opening and closing of those semilunar valve, of the AV valves. We've got the trabeculae carneae, which are muscular columns within the inner wall of the right and left ventricles. We have the pectinate muscles. The pectinate muscles are going to be the muscles that help close the atria. The chordae tendineae, those are the tendon, the connective tissues that connect the AV valves with the trabeculae, the papillary muscles. So we're talking about these things right here. Okay, so here is our heart talking about the route that blood goes through. So on the right side, deoxygenated blood comes from the superior and inferior vena cava, so we're right here, into the right atrium. Now there aren't any valves in between the superior and inferior vena cava and the atrium. It's not necessary, and we'll talk about why in a couple of weeks. So here is that blood coming in. Blood passes from the right atrium into the right ventricle through the tricuspid or right AV valve. From there, blood gets pumped from the right ventricle through the pulmonary semilunar valve, which is right here, up into the pulmonary trunk, which is this section of blood vessel right here, before it splits into the right and left. Here is the right, here is the left pulmonary arteries, which eventually go to the right and left lung. Once it leaves the lungs, it's going to go to the left side of the heart. So blood is going to come from the pulmonary veins into the left atrium, carrying oxygenated blood from the lungs. It's going to go from the left atrium into the left ventricle by way of the mitral or left AV valve. From there, the left ventricle is going to contract, pushing blood through the aortic semilunar valve into the ascending aorta, through the aortic arch right here, the descending aorta, and the rest of the body, including some of these blood vessels that go up. Now, let me tell you something. Go back through those last two sets of slides that I talked about and write them down in one nice step-by-step diagram, because a lot of people struggle with the direction that blood flow goes through the heart and the different processes that pass it. And I'm going to tell you right now, I'm going to expect you to know those steps in the level of detail that I just went through. Okay, similar to when we talked about muscle contractions, we talked about action potentials. Okay, I'm going to expect you to know them in the level of detail that I just went through it. So take the time to memorize that process. Okay, you'll be better off in the long run. All right, structural differences between the left and the right ventricles. They're pretty significant because the demands required by the different sides are very different. The left ventricle is larger with thicker walls. It holds the same amount of volume. So let me show you. Here is the wall of the left ventricle right here. Here is the wall of the right ventricle. Now it doesn't look like it, okay, conservation of space and stuff like that. The interior volume is the same. I'm going to say that again. The interior volume is the same between the left and the right ventricle. The reason why we have such drastic differences in the thickness of the walls of the left versus the walls of the right ventricle is because of where the blood has to go. the left ventricle has to move the same amount of blood in the same amount of time to your entire body, all the way down to the tips of your toes and the top of your head, in the same amount of time that the right ventricle has to push blood to the lungs and back. It's right there, okay? It doesn't have to go very far. And so in order to make sure that everything moves at the same time, at the same rate, the walls of the left ventricle are significantly thicker than the walls of the right. We're going to look at that again when we talk about blood vessels, okay? All right, take a look at this real quick. We've got some coronary arteries, some of the ones that you're going to need to know. Coronary arteries are arteries that are specifically feeding blood to the tissues of the heart. So if you hear somebody saying they had a massive coronary, either metaphorically or actually, we're talking about the arteries that feed blood to the heart itself, okay? So, ones that we need to make sure that we know about, right and left coronary arteries and veins, right there and right there. We've got the coronary sinus, which is this giant vein right here that drains the whole heart. So study some of those. You'll need to be able to identify those. That's what I wanted to say. All right, last thing that we're going to do is going to kind of talk about, we'll end it with this one. This is part one. Part two, we'll talk about the actual physiology and how the heart beats. I like to call that cardiac physiology. But basically, here we have the conducting system of the heart. The heart has its own nervous system, basically, that's completely independent of your actual nervous system. This is why people can have severe brain damage, so they're effectively dead. They're brain dead, but their heart is still beating. Okay, and it's because of these structures. Now, some of the ones that we're going to have to know about, and we'll talk about it in greater detail, include the SA node right here, the AV node right there, and some other ones like that. So this is basically the nervous system that is telling the muscles to contract in a very rhythmic, very measured, very orderly process, and we'll talk about that in excruciating detail later, like in a week or so. So we'll stop it right there with the anatomy of the heart. Please make sure that you've got all this stuff down. Go back and look at this stuff. Look at the note slides. Look at the other notes, the textbook and stuff like that. Some of the other links that I've posted in Echo. If you have any questions, let me know. Send me a remind message. Send me an email. Ask me in class. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing y'all again soon. Hey, I heart you guys.